right, so I'm going to start the series on distributism, and I'm going to be looking in particular at GK Chesterton's The Outline of Sanity here, which is a series of newspaper columns that he later made into a book. Now, just a little bit about Chesterton before we start. Obviously, Chesterton was a very big man. I mean, he cut a big figure because he was a large human being. And large not only physically, but also in his personality. It's, even in his writing, you can tell that he just had an incredible sense of humor, that he was kind of a singular person. And one of the most interesting things for me about this man is that he never got, he didn't get the typical education. He didn't get a liberal arts education when he went to college. Instead, he went to art school to be an illustrator. He was trained to be an illustrator, and in fact, he started his career by doing just that. So all of the learning that you detect in Chesterton's books would be from self-education. And so he was a very, very brilliant man who was able to do that throughout his life, and that's really admirable. He married Frances and became a more serious Anglican after spending his youth as really not. The family was nominally Anglican, but he became more of a serious Christian when he got married. And then, with much controversy, he converted to Catholicism late in his life in 1922. He died in 1936, and this book was first published in 1926, so this would have been after his conversion. He is the author, among other things, of the famous Father Brown Priest Detective series, and so if you want entertainment, I do think maybe I've listened to an audiobook of a Father Brown detective series. If you like that kind of thing, it's very enjoyable. So as I said, he started illustrating for a publisher at first, but before long he'd been lured into writing columns for the newspapers, and those became very popular, and it became evident that he had what it takes to appeal to the sensibilities of a wide readership. He also, in addition to writing the columns and the fiction, he did a lot of radio talks on BBC, apparently for years. And I haven't listened to any of those. I'd be kind of interested to do so. He ended up writing 80 books, hundreds of poems, about 200 short stories, in addition to countless columns. And so he spent his entire life doing this kind of work. And again, that's pretty incredible considering he started out wanting to be an illustrator. That's what he wanted to do. And he did do that. He was decent at that. In fact, this here is one of his illustrations. It's a self-portrait of sorts. And it also conveys, to a certain extent, his distributism, with the advocacy of the 3 acres and a cow. Okay. So, but in the area of Christian apologetics, the two most famous books from Chesterton, which you would want to take a look at if you really wanted to seriously deal with that side of things, are Orthodoxy, published in 1908, and The Everlasting Man, published in 1925. And I think the book that I read a few years back was, or at least got a little ways into, was Orthodoxy. I think I have it on my bookshelf somewhere. I'll probably go back to it. But I read somewhere that The Outline of Sanity was actually a great place to start. Although it's kind of obscure, it's not the book that most people turn to first. It's one of those other ones. But The Outline of Sanity is where I decided to go, partly too because it's relatively late in his life. It's after his conversion, and it's written for a popular audience because so many of these were first newspaper columns, and so I figured it would be a very, it would be an entry point that would be fairly easy to do. So, I've already mentioned that the reason why I want to look at Chesterton is for his philosophy of distributism. And it occurred to me, I'm teaching ancient and medieval political thought right now and covering Aristotle's Politics, and as I'm reading through the Politics again, I realized just how profoundly Aristotle's view of property affected Catholic Christian thought about property, and then, of course, through that, Chesterton's view of property, because Aristotle makes this argument that, the problem with too many Greek city-states is that they have the few rich and the many who are poor, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, for these two parties to get along. And so there was always a lot of political turmoil. There were civil wars based upon these two factions. And he proposes in the Politics this idea of polity. Polity relied upon the making of a large middle class, and he actually praises those regimes that have tried to distribute property more evenly across the population, because Aristotle says that only if the majority of people own some property, not so much as to make them tyrannical, like the oligarchs, and not so little as to make them desperate, like the poor, only if enough people have that middling level of property will they feel secure, and will they feel as though they are attached to the polity as a whole, to everybody in the city, and have an interest, take an interest in how it's governed, to protect their own holdings as well as to protect everybody else's. So just to make a note of that Aristotle is probably the originator of the idea of distributism. And that helps me, and hopefully will help you, to understand, where Chesterton is coming from. So what I'm going to do now is just take you through the three definitions, right, that I think are going to be helpful throughout this book, that he puts in this first chapter as an introduction. He wants people to know, what does he mean by capitalism? What does he mean by socialism? And what does he mean by distributism? Okay, so distributism is like a middle ground, or a third way that's neither of the other two. So he says of capitalism that it is that economic condition in which there is a class of capitalists, roughly recognizable and relatively small, in whose possession so much of the capital is concentrated as to necessitate a very large majority of the citizens serving those capitalists for a wage. Okay? So, and he elaborates that this system really shouldn't be, called capitalism. It might be better to call it proletarianism, because he argues capital is simply resources, right? And capital doesn't have to end up in the hands of a very small number of people, but in capitalism, it does. So he says the truth of what we call capitalism ought to be called proletarianism. The point of it is not that some people have capital, but that most people only have wages because they do not have capital. And he later on uses the term wage dependence. And this is what Chesterton, objects to, that the vast majority of people are dependent on wages, which means that they actually serve these few capitalists who really control everything because they control most of the property. For him, apparently, this is an injustice, and it's kind of ugly, okay? He says, as a matter of fact, capitalism is a monster that grows in deserts, and he argues that it didn't spring up easily in places where property was evenly distributed and where people thought that they could make a decent living through their own work, providing for themselves and selling what they made to others, but rather it grew up and took off particularly rapidly in places where there were not a large amount of small holdings. He says particularly in America, where the settlers came and there weren't that many Native Americans, that not much population density to begin with, and in addition to that, the Native Americans didn't have really a concept of private property in the same way, so it was very easy to take over and begin to build. in a capitalist system. He also mentions that in parts of Europe in which oligarchy long ago reduced peasants to very little property, those were the places where capitalism grew first. So think there this process of enclosure in which the aristocrats, removed the peasant proprietors from their land and enclosed it so that they could make more money, driving those people off the land and off of any sort of quasi-independence into the cities, which fueled the rise of capitalism. Okay, so I think this is what he's referring to there. That has to come first, because if people can't hold on to their property, small properties, and if there's enough people who have them, they will resist as best they can capitalism. They won't have an interest in it. All right, so after defining briefly capitalism and how he sees it, he then turns to socialism. And the way that Chesterton sees socialism is, it resonates with the way I've viewed these two systems for a long time. They're sort of similar in a way. And I guess the biggest difference for Chesterton with socialism is that it concentrates all the capital and all the power into the state, as opposed to into a few more or less oligarchs. Okay. So here he says that socialism is a system which makes the corporate unit of society responsible for all its economic processes, or all those affecting life and essential living, meaning the government. The government has all the responsibility. He says this is the very reverse of anarchy. It is an extreme enthusiasm for authority. It is in many ways worthy of the moral dignity of the mind. It is a collective acceptance of a very complete responsibility, but it is silly of socialists to complain of our saying that it must be a destruction of liberty. So the scary thing about socialism for Chesterton, who of course is living at a time when the Bolshevik Revolution, very recently, it happened about 10 years before this book was published. A little bit more than that, maybe. No, about 10 years or so, 9, is that it doesn't allow, and really can't allow, for dissent. The whole idea is that the state has to be in charge of all of the material assets, and if it allows dissent, if it allows opposition, then the control of the people over the property can't be maintained. So it makes sense that the state would want to control everything and not allow dissent, but that is obviously destructive to liberty and most likely to turn into a dictatorship. So this is a danger. Okay, but in both cases, whether it's capitalism or socialism, you have the concentration of property into the hands of the few, whether it's the capitalists or whether it's the socialist government. And by socialism here, we mean something like the Bolsheviks, right? The Bolshevik government, the Soviet Union. Not democratic socialism, which is, I suppose, more, you might say, like a mixed situation of capitalism and socialism. Okay. All right, so, he's knocked down, he's begun the process of criticizing both of those systems, and then he turns to distributism. And there he spends quite a bit of time. He argues with George Bernard Shaw, who criticizes the idea, basically represents the criticism of distributism, that it's backwards looking, that, we can't have that. In fact, Chesterton says they argue that it never existed, or that it doesn't exist, and he basically says, well, that's obviously not true. It has existed. Of course, he's right about that. But more seriously, they argue that small holdings are destined to be gobbled up, just as they have been in the past, okay? And that it's just untenable to maintain a situation where many people own a little property. I have the picture of the Mondragon corporation here, because it's an example of distributism in our time. As of now, it has something like 81,000 employees. It's a corporation of sorts, but it's a collective corporation based on distributive principles. It was founded by a priest during the World War II period. It took off in the early 50s. And it's become an international concern, actually. And the distributism in this corporation is to be seen in the fact that they basically have rules that say that the lowest person has to be paid a certain amount, and that the highest person can't be paid more than, I think it was 5 times what the lowest person is paid. So they have rules about how the profits, so to speak, of this corporation are going to be distributed. And the CEOs and the bosses in Mondragon are not paid nearly as much as those in other corporations. But nevertheless, so they, like people work their way up through the ranks, and the thing as a going concern is actually very profitable. And does so on these distributed principles. So the basic principle of distributism doesn't have to mean that we give everybody 3 acres and a cow. It doesn't have to mean, I guess this is why I mentioned this, it doesn't have to mean that we go back to, Wendell Berry paradise, where everybody is a free-holding, peasant, and we get rid of technology. This is the scare quote situation, right? that people refer to. It's really going to be some sort of cultural disaster to like embrace this idea. Not necessarily, and I think the Mondragon Corporation is one I'd like to study a little bit more and maybe do a video on in and of itself, because they've managed to do something like distributism in a very successful way. So Chesterton says that, distributism is against the 2 extremes. So he poses it as the middle between 2 extremes of capitalism and communism. It is a policy of small distributed property. Okay, and he argues that it has existed, and so it can exist again, and he's not arguing that it has to exist the way it used to. Okay, now he was writing this in the 20s, in the 1920s, when you think about it, my God, almost 100 years ago, right? So things have changed drastically. It made more sense to him to think about perhaps allowing people to have 3 acres and a cow. Okay, but that doesn't mean that if he was looking at our situation today, 3 acres and a cow would make any sense to him. So this is just it's a red herring, okay? All right, so there you go. There's an introduction to Chesterton and the outline of sanity. And so next week I will tackle probably a couple of chapters here and get more into the meat of his argument. Okay, bye.